The 6-ton block of red granite struck the water face first. For a fraction of a second, the carved features of Hapi, god of the Nile's flooding, god of abundance, god of the yearly miracle that kept 30 million mouths fed, held their expression of serene authority. Then the sea closed over him, silt folded in behind, sand packed itself into the creases of his headdress and the ridges of his ceremonial belt. Within a generation, no one alive could point to where the statue had fallen. Within a century, the city he had guarded for hundreds of years began to follow him down, and within a millennium, the entire place, temples, harbors, processional avenues, the customs house where every amphora of Greek wine entering Egypt was weighed and taxed, all of it had been swallowed so completely that even its name nearly vanished from human memory. The city was called Thonis by the Egyptians. The Greeks knew it as Herakleion. For most of recorded history, scholars assumed these were two different towns, if they believed they had existed at all. The references were scattered and fragmentary. A line in Herodotus about a great temple built where the hero Heracles first set foot in Africa. Mentioned by the geographer Strabo, placing a city called Herakleion at the canopic mouth of the Nile, due east of Canopus. A romantic legend that Helen of Sparta had sheltered there with Paris of Troy before the war that would consume them both. Beautiful stories, but stories told without coordinates, without ruins, without proof. That is where things stood for a very long time. Centuries passed. The Nile Delta reshaped itself. Coastlines shifted. The Mediterranean took what it wanted and buried the evidence under meters of sediment. By the modern era, the city existed only as a footnote, a phantom in the margins of classical literature. The kind of place that serious historians mentioned carefully and amateur romantics got far too excited about. Then, in 1933, something small happened that would take decades to matter. A pilot with the Royal Air Force, flying a routine patrol over Abu Qir Bay, about 15 miles northeast of Alexandria, glanced down through the clear water and noticed something on the seabed. Shapes, too regular to be natural formations. He reported it. The report was filed, and there it sat, more or less forgotten, for more than 60 years. It was a French underwater archaeologist named Franck Godillot who finally decided that the old pilot's sighting, combined with the ancient texts, justified a serious investigation. In 1996, Godillot and a team from the European Institute for Underwater Archaeology, working in cooperation with the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities, began a systematic survey of the bay. The research area they mapped out was enormous, 11 kilometers by 15, and the conditions were punishing. Abu Qir Bay is not the transparent Caribbean. The water is murky. Visibility can drop to almost nothing after a storm, when currents churn up centuries of compacted sand and silt. You cannot simply dive in and look around. You look with instruments first, and with your eyes only, when the instruments tell you there is something worth seeing. Godillot's team used side-scan sonar, directing pulses of sound energy at the seabed and building a picture from the echoes. They used nuclear magnetic resonance magnetometers to detect anomalies in the Earth's magnetic field. The kind of anomalies created when the weight of a large stone building, pressing down over centuries, fractures and compresses the sediment beneath it. Slowly, a topography emerged, not a natural one, a human one. Canal systems, harbor basins, the rectangular footprints of monumental architecture, all of it sitting beneath roughly 10 meters of water and an unknowable depth of sand, 6.5 kilometers from the present-day Egyptian coast. The first major discoveries came in the year 2000. Divers, armed with water dredges, essentially massive underwater vacuum cleaners, designed to strip away overlying sand layer by layer without damaging what lies beneath, began pulling fragments of the colossal Hapi statue from the seabed. 7 pieces, salt-encrusted but remarkably intact. When reassembled, the figure stood 5.5 meters tall, carved from red granite with a level of craftsmanship that made clear this was no provincial backwater. This was a city that could afford the best. Around the fragments of Hapi, the divers found other things: the ruins of temple walls, shards of pottery, Coins, oil lamps, gold jewelry, bronze figurines, ritual implements, not the scattered debris of a shipwreck, the layered, dense, overlapping remains of a place where thousands of people had lived and worked and worshipped for more than 1,000 years. To understand what Thonis Heracleion was, you have to understand what it did. Before Alexander the Great founded Alexandria in 331 BC, there was no Alexandria. The Nile Delta's primary gateway to the Mediterranean, the place where East met West, where pharaonic Egypt interfaced with the Greek trading world, was Thonis Heracleion. Every merchant ship arriving from Athens, from Cyprus, from the Aegean Islands, carrying silver and copper, and wine and oil, had to pass through this port. Every cargo of Egyptian grain and papyrus and perfume headed the other direction passed through it too. The city controlled the choke point. It collected the taxes. And the taxes were not trivial. A stele recovered from the site, magnificent slab of black stone, standing 2 meters tall, carved with hieroglyphics that dated to the reign of Pharaoh Nectanebo I in the early 4th century BC, records the royal decree in plain language: 1/10 of all gold, silver, timber, processed wood, and everything arriving from the Sea of the Greeks shall be given as divine offerings to the goddess Neith. 10% of all international trade, skimmed off the top, dedicated to a single deity. The economics of this port were staggering. That same stele, incidentally, solved one of Egyptology's most persistent minor puzzles. By comparing its inscription to other monuments found on land, scholars were finally able to confirm that Thonis and Heracleion were not 2 separate cities, as had been assumed for generations, but a single settlement with 2 names, one Egyptian, one Greek, reflecting the bicultural reality of a place where pharaonic and Hellenic worlds overlapped. They overlapped profoundly. The archaeological material from the seabed tells this story with an almost overwhelming richness. Greek helmets lying beside Egyptian ones, Cypriot statuettes, Athenian perfume bottles, incense burners of mixed stylistic origin, more than 700 ancient anchors of various shapes and periods scattered across the harbour zones, 125 identified shipwrecks dating from the 6th to the 2nd century BC. This was not a monoculture. It was a nexus. And at its center, binding it all together, was religion. The great temple of Amun-Gereb dominated the city. Its foundations have been traced on the seabed, and its scale was formidable, but the religious life of Thonis Heracleion extended far beyond a single building. Each year, the city hosted the celebration of the Mysteries of Osiris, an elaborate, kingdom-wide ceremony marking the death and resurrection of the god of the underworld. In the secrecy of the temple, priests prepared 2 ritual figures of Osiris, one fashioned from soil and barley seed, the other from ground semi-precious stones and expensive resins. The soil figure was placed in a granite tank and watered with Nile water until the barley germinated, a living symbol of resurrection. It was then placed in a papyrus barge alongside 33 other ceremonial vessels. The flotilla was illuminated by 365 oil lamps, one for each day of the year, and sailed in procession down the canal to the neighboring settlement of Canopus. Archaeologists have recovered small lead replicas of these papyrus boats from the seabed, votive offerings thrown into the water by spectators, the ancient equivalent of tossing a coin into a fountain and making a wish. These are not the kinds of details you get from a looted tomb or a single lucky find. This is the accumulated texture of a functioning civilization, preserved in a way that almost never happens on land, where centuries of subsequent habitation, demolition, rebuilding, and scavenging obliterate the layers. The sea, for all its destructive power, is also a remarkable conservator. It buries things and then leaves them alone. But the sea is also what destroyed the city in the first place, and the manner of that destruction carries a lesson that resonates uncomfortably with the present. Thonis Heracleion was built on a network of islands and sandbars at the Nile's mouth, essentially a city constructed on waterlogged sediment. For centuries, this was fine. The ground held. The canals functioned. The buildings stood. But the geology was never stable. The entire Nile Delta is a dynamic system, constantly shifting, subsiding, redistributing its own weight. The weight on the central island of Thonis Heraklion was considerable. Massive stone temples, harbor infrastructure, the accumulated masonry of a wealthy metropolis, all pressing down on clay that had no bedrock beneath it. Sometime around the end of the 2nd century BC, probably after an unusually severe flood, the process that geologists call soil liquefaction began. It is one of the most terrifying phenomena in the natural world, and one of the least dramatic to describe. In liquefaction, waterlogged soil that has been behaving like a solid suddenly, under stress, an earthquake tremor, a flood, an excessive load, begins to behave like a liquid. The particles lose their friction. The ground stops being ground. Buildings that stood for generations sink in minutes. The ancient historians recorded earthquakes and tidal waves in the region during this period, and the archaeological evidence aligns with their accounts. The supply of new pottery and coins into the city appears to have stopped abruptly at this time. The temples collapsed into the water. The great statue of Hapi toppled and sank. Some people stayed. The archaeological record shows continued, diminished habitation through the Roman period and into the early centuries of Arab rule. But the city was dying. Sea levels continued to rise. The remaining structures continued to sink. By the 8th century AD, the Mediterranean had covered everything, and Thonis Heraklion became what it would remain for the next 1200 years, a ghost beneath the waves, unknown and unreachable. What strikes me about this story is not the spectacle of rediscovery, though the spectacle is real and considerable, but the arithmetic of what remains unknown. Frank Goddio has estimated that only about 5% of the city's area has been excavated so far. 95% is still down there, buried under sand in murky water, 6.5 kilometers from a coastline that is itself under threat from the same forces that destroyed the ancient city. The work continues, season by season, fragment by fragment. Each year's expedition uncovers new material. In recent campaigns, the team has found the remains of a military vessel, additional temple structures, Greek weapons, and ceramics that push the timeline of habitation in unexpected directions. But the deeper question, the one that Aurelia Masson-Berghoff, curator of the British Museum's landmark exhibition on the sunken cities, raised when she spoke about the project, is about the people we cannot yet see. The rulers are visible. The priests are visible. The gods, carved in stone and cast in bronze, have survived. But where are the dock workers who unloaded the grain ships? The customs clerks who counted amphorae? The women who sewed the sails? The children who watched the Osiris procession from the canal banks, squinting against the light of 365 oil lamps reflected on the water? Their homes were mud brick. Mud brick dissolves. Their tools were wood. Wood rots. Their lives were not commemorated in granite or recorded on steles. They are the 95%, not just of the unexcavated ground, but of the human story that ground contains. Today, the Egyptian Mediterranean coastline remains one of the most vulnerable stretches of inhabited land on Earth when it comes to rising sea levels and subsiding ground. The same geological forces that unmade Thonis Heraklion, the slow compression of delta sediment, the creeping intrusion of saltwater, the catastrophic potential of liquefaction in a region prone to seismic activity, are still at work. Modern Alexandria, the city that replaced Thonis Heraklion as Egypt's great port, faces projections that would be familiar to anyone who has studied the ancient city's decline. The irony is not subtle. It does not need to be pointed out. It simply sits there, like a 6-ton statue of a river god, waiting at the edge of the water, gazing out with absolute calm at whatever comes next.